Seth, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. Your work is so beautiful. I see a lot of ceramic work, and this just blows my mind. So I want to know how you got into ceramics. Was it always your first art form?
You know, this has been a long journey for me. It started when I was probably 8 or 9 years old. I used to come home and watch a public television production, Reading Rainbow.
Of course.
And so I blame my addiction to clay on LeVar Burton. He read a book about making pottery, he did a demonstration, and I went out in my yard and I dug up some clay and made some pots, and my family used to burn our garbage, and I snuck my pots in the garbage barrel and fired these little pots, dug through the ashes in the morning, and they didn't blow up and they survived. So that's kind of my early experience with clay. Walked by the ceramics room in high school and saw the spinny thingies, which I didn't know what they were called at the time.
Right.
Potter's wheels. And I walked in and I didn't leave for 3 years. I spent 3 years as a high school student taking ceramics. I spent, every spare moment in there that I could. And I thought, in college, I'm gonna see what happens. And I didn't know what I was gonna major in college, but I knew that I did want to continue to keep my hands in the clay. So in college, I did take some ceramics classes. And next thing I knew, I was an art major and I was going to be a high school art teacher. That was kind of the original plan. And then I decided to go to graduate school and get a Master of Fine Arts, which really kind of changed my life. Yeah, changed the game for me.
I want to get to that, but first I want to ask you, what is it about throwing on the potter's wheel that keeps you coming back?
Yeah, well, the wheel is a tool, and I kind of treat it as a tool to make my work. So early on, I was making work that was more kind of organic, a little bit wabi-sabi, a little bit more loose, and that really didn't kind of fit my personality and my style. I really wanted to make things as precise and as clean as I could. And my influence that kind of crept into my work later of architecture, these clean, smooth silhouettes and lines. I can use the wheel as a tool to really get those forms and the shapes that I want. That's why I continued to use the wheel rather than building something by hand.
So that brings us to grad school.
Right.
You did some traveling. Tell me how that was a game changer.
Yeah, so I traveled with a mentor of mine, Doug Spear. He's the director of ceramics at Anderson Ranch Art Center. He's since left that position, but I went to Chile, Curamilla, and we built a wood kiln. It was a wood kiln building workshop, and we built the kiln during the day, made pots at night by lantern light, and then at the end of the 2 weeks we fired the kiln, and we had a few days when the kiln was cooling. And I think the most important thing that happened to me during that trip was not making the pottery and not interacting with that kiln building experience, but it was this experience I had with the lighthouse that really helped me understand what it was about architecture that was so important to my work and to my research. And so as the kilns were cooling, I was taking a walk out on this beautiful peninsula, and up on a tall point was this lighthouse. And there was this striking silhouette against the blue sky, and the light bulb went off in my mind, and that is why architecture is so important. It's that silhouette and that space around architecture that's so important. So returned to Nebraska, University of Nebraska is where I did my MFA, and I went to the architecture library, and I stumbled across these old images of Prague. And Prague is known as the city of spires. And so that's kind of where my understanding and my deep dive into the research of architecture kind of began was at that point.
So how do you translate these images from Prague and Chile, and how do you make that happen on the wheel?
Yeah, so I didn't actually go to Prague or to Turkey or to these other places until several years later. I was experiencing these images online or in a book. So what I'm doing is I'm assimilating these architectural references and these Persian and Ottoman Empire pottery and metal vessels, and I'm kind of creating a new thing. So they start out as sketches, but they evolve because I work on a series of pieces, and each one kind of evolves into something different.
I look over your shoulder and I see these pieces and I'm like, that's metal. That has to be metal. It's not metal.
Right.
So how do you get that smooth,
Sure.
perfect finish?
So I mean, I'm using essentially I'm using the wheel as a vertical lathe. So I'm throwing pieces a little on the thicker side, but then I'm using a tool to really tool and clean that line. And then I use some ribs and sponges and really kind of smooth those things out. And I'm using stoneware clay, and I fire in two ways. I fire in a gas reduction kiln and reduction atmosphere, and then I also fire in a wood kiln. The gas kiln, I'm applying a white slip clay covering over the brown stoneware. And then after it's fired for the first time, after the bisque firing, I'm either dipping or spraying on glazes. And then these pots go into the gas kiln in reduction firing, but then I cool them slowly, and those crystals grow through the surface of that kind of matte glaze during the firing. And that kind of comes from that direct influence from Islamic metalwork. With the wood kiln, I'm able to also achieve a metallic surface using high iron clays and high iron clay slips. During the firing, the ash travels through the kiln and lands on the shoulders of all the pots, the surfaces, melts and creates a glaze. But we're also cooling the kiln in a reduction atmosphere too as well. So when we're done, we don't just stop throwing wood in the kiln. We're actually closing up all of the air ports and the dampers and everything, sealing up really tightly. And then every 20 or 30 minutes, we're actually throwing a couple pieces of wood to keep that combustion happening and keeping that reduction atmosphere going. And what happens is I end up with those metallic, metal-like surfaces.
I was so interested to hear you say that you use the wheel sort of like a vertical lathe.
Yeah.
Having talked to several woodworkers,
Yeah.
I kind of have an idea of how that would work.
Yeah.
But how do you go about taking the idea in your head or the sketch and using that lathe to bring it to life?
So I'm building a lot in sections. I rarely throw something in one piece.
Okay.
I'm thinking architecturally. I'm thinking, okay, here is the main body of the form, and then there's usually like a shoulder or a roof line, and then additional pieces. So I wheel throw my pieces and assemble them when they're leather hard or kind of stiff, and then I score them and I apply liquid slip and join them together. But I'm doing all the joinery on the wheel, and then I'm recentering this assembled piece, and then I'm using my trimming tools to really kind of refine the shapes and the curves and the lines.
Do you have a favorite part of the process?
I would say making the finials on top of the.
They're so cool.
On top of the, so I'm referring to finials on architecture, so
Right.
mosques and temples and palaces and stuff, churches. It's really that moment when I'm putting the finial on the piece, which kind of really completes it. And that for me is the most rewarding, most exciting time when all the parts and pieces come together, and then you put that little finial on the top, and you're done.
One of the coolest things about this interview is that I know that you are sharing all of this
Yeah.
with students,
Yeah.
not just your love of ceramics, but you built a fire kiln.
Right.
Tell me how that came to be. When did you make the decision that you wanted to do it? Why was it important to you?
Right, so, because wood firing is such an important part of my own research, I needed to have that kiln here. So when I first got here in 2016, I went to work to find the funding to build the kiln. And I have a really great friend that teaches at Ball State University, Ted Neal. He is a master kiln builder, and I've built 7 or 8 kilns with him over the years. And I invited him, I employed him to come and come help me build the kiln. And I really think it's an important thing to also involve students in I remember as a student, I had kiln building experiences that really kind of helped me understand the technology behind ceramics. And so I'm always trying to look for opportunities to have my students help me with these kiln building projects, but also to give my students tools, more than just the electric kiln or the gas kiln, but we have a wood kiln now, and we also have a sodium vapor kiln now as well, which a soda kiln is it's a gas-fired kiln, and during the firing we're actually pulling bricks out of the side of the kiln, and we're spraying sodium, mixture of sodium and water into the kiln during the firing. So.
Rarely am I this excited for all of the people who benefit from your work. So this has been really fun. Thank you for everything you do, and your work is just exceptional.
Thank you very much.
For more information, visit SethGreenPottery.com.
Arts in Focus on PBS Fort Wayne is funded in part by